to manipulate us into World War I. They wanted World War I because they wanted a horrible incident with a lot of dead people so that they could get people to go along with giving up their sovereignty and creating a world government. Well, that's what the League of Nations was all about, and when that failed, we had to have World War II, and then since that has failed to bring about suddenly the United Nations, why it's not effective, that's why we're going to have World War III. But if you'd like to read that article by Oscar Callaway, it is available from Radio Liberty. I would suggest you order that from us by calling 1-800-544-8927, and also get our 4-CD set on Control of the Media and the book, The New Media Monopoly, The New Media Monopoly by Professor Ben Bagdikian. You need to understand the media is controlled, and most of what you think you believe isn't true. And it didn't just start yesterday. This article from the Congressional Record goes back to 1917. Go right ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, and so at the same time, of course, you do different things. And so another thing I put into my book, Secret Records Revealed, at that exact same time, was from the diary of Lord Esher, who was one of Cecil Rhodes' top 3 guys, and he's talking to Morgenthau, who was Woodrow Wilson's money man, and saying how we have to get America blood shed as soon as possible to steady the French and get America into World War I. And they literally would pay the French. I put another quote in another place from the individual actually admitting that, how they were going to bribe the French government officials. You get into World War I and we'll pay you off, and so forth and so on. So it's very complex and intricate, the control mechanisms of various individuals and their schemes. And in terms of the media, of course, they know there's a burgeoning television industry coming up as early as 1928, and CBS, which at the time was radio, that's when Edward Bernays wrote his book Propaganda, became the chief advisor for William Paley, who was a CFR member, and there Bernays said, we know how to manipulate you, we're like an invisible government, so forth and so on. And so they would get into radio, and there was what's called the Radio Project, and I go into that more in the sequel to Secret Records Reveal, which is called The Globalists. And in that book, I go into Frank Stanton and other key fellows in what's called the Radio Project, and, that War of the Worlds with Orson Welles, and that everybody thought that was just a scary little prank. No, it's all part of this plan to study the public and see how you react to things. They even had plans that they studied you in your neighborhood. They didn't study everybody in every neighborhood. But in the 30s, there was also an actual project, and I cover this in my books. I think maybe a little bit Secret Records, mostly The Globalists, how they literally created during FDR's administration I think J.L. Marino was responsible for this, and sociometry is what he called it. They would actually have a neighborhood. They planned the neighborhood and strategically placed families beside each other and switched them around, one with religious values to see how a neighbor with certain religious values affected you. It was a really, really masterful, deceitful, high-level study of how they could control your neighborhood. And we'll pick up after the break.
And, of course, our guest is Dr. Dennis Cuddy. You must understand, ladies and gentlemen, nothing as it appears to be. You, of course, are being manipulated. Our country is being manipulated. The war is imminent. The collapse of our economy is imminent. And most people are going to end up being impoverished before this is over.
Let us swear allegiance to a land that's free. Let us all be grateful.
Dennis, you go right ahead.
Okay, so anyway, in 1904, Thomas Lawson was talking about amalgamated copper and the reach of the Rockefellers, for example, to every hamlet in the land and so on. And so one way, and this is what I've been saying for about 25 years or so, is one way they move this plan along is through economics, because while people are deliberately kept ignorant of economics, that really is how events are shaped and controlled. Even military operations are largely based on economics. And so what they did is they created panics. They called them panics back then. Now we call them recessions or depressions. But back then they had the panic of 1907, and they created that. They created the panic of oh my goodness, what are we going to do? Unemployment, I can't buy bread, and so forth and so on. And so they gave a little shock across the populace. And so that allowed them to say, okay, we will save the day. We'll give you a Federal Reserve, 1913. But they really didn't present it as such. Right? What they did was, you always have to fake somebody out. It's like one of these old Westerns, right, where you distract the people to look one way, to the left, while what you're really doing is to the right. There's an old John Wayne movie, I think it's Fort Apache, where Henry Fonda is this sort of, he's an elite West Point type of guy, and he just can't believe when he comes out west that the Indians, as they called them, the savages, would be smart enough to think something like this through. But John Wayne keeps telling him, no, you don't understand. Do not. Colonel, he was a colonel, Henry Fonda's colonel. Do not ride us into the canyon. Do not do that. Yes, I know the Indians and the cloud of dust, and they're running away from us, those 100 Indians, into the canyon, and they want us to follow them into the canyon. But, Colonel, it is a trick. And so Henry Fonda turns to John Wayne, what do you think? He's a master strategist like Genghis Khan? I can't believe that those Apaches are that smart. Dummy. So anyway, what happens is he allows John Wayne to stay back, and he charges, hurrah, down into the canyon. He gets slaughtered, right? And John Wayne, of course, is spared. But it's the same sort of thing. So what they did after the panic of 1907 is they pretended at one point to be this, awful people trying to control what was going on in the economy. I mean, they actually wanted people to say, aha, we caught ya, right? And so their initial move toward the Federal Reserve was to have a feint, as they call it. They faked a move in one direction so that people would say, aha, we're on to you, while secretly, behind the scenes, they all got in their little train cars with fake names and went down to Jekyll Island and really plotted what they were going to do. And that's why Frank Vanderlip, and I put this quote in my book, Secret Records Revealed, in 1935, years later, in the Saturday Evening Post, he said about that time, back then, the early part of the century when they went to Jekyll Island, he said, I never felt more like a conspirator than at any other time in my life. We had code names in this little, train car, private car of J.P. Morgan's and so forth. And so what they were doing was faking the people out.
Hold that thought. We'll be back in a moment. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and so I guess Dr. Dennis Cuddy. And basically, of course, most of what's gone on in our society has been to confuse the American people,
right,
to allow a small number of people to gain control of the monetary system. You control the monetary system, you control the government. Most people think that we elect our representatives, and our representatives vote. Our representatives go back to Washington, D.C., and when they get there, they find out that the way that you're going to be able to stay there and retire as you go along with the establishment, and if you don't, they will crush you. And basically, of course, the establishment is made of the people who control the monetary system, and basically they create money out of nothing. They've effectively destroyed 96 or 97% of the value of our currency from 1913, all the time telling us, we're fighting inflation and giving you a stable monetary system. And basically, of course, the ultimate goal is a one-world government, a one-world monetary system, and the destruction of Christianity. We're dealing against organized evil, ladies and gentlemen. These people know exactly what they're doing, but because they control the media, the courts, they control the banking system, they have their people within the military, they control education, and suddenly they have their people planted within our churches. Why most people have very little idea what's really going on, but we're heading towards a major catastrophe, and it's coming in the very foreseeable future. I can't tell you whether it's months or weeks or years. It could be a couple of years. But the whole system's going to fall apart, and their ultimate goal is a one-world dictatorship under a small, well-organized, well-financed, and brutal ruling elite. Go right ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, and what will happen is the stock market is very high, and everybody knows it's too high. There will be a quote correction. It'll be a correction, all right. And you'll start to see the signs of the impending disaster next year, I think, and then by 2016 it'll be on its way downward. Picking up where I left off, though, so what they did is fake out the American people so that they can get their Federal Reserve real sneaky-like in at midnight just before Christmas, sneaking in there, and Woodrow Wilson go along with it. But they can't just allow Wilson to trust Wilson. What they had was, and Bernard Baruch is one of these paralegal guys, and in Curtis Dahl's book titled FDR, My Exploited Father-in-Law, he talks about how Bernard Baruch and these guys led Woodrow Wilson like a puppy dog in 1912 up to see them so they could read him the Riot Act, say this is what you're going to do, Woodrow. And then as he left, Curtis Dahl's inside source said they'd all left and said, let's see how our other candidate's doing. And by that they meant Teddy Roosevelt. See, Teddy had been president before. Then you had William Howard Taft, and Teddy goes off, shooting, wildebeest or something somewhere because he fancied himself a real outdoorsman and hunter. But then he comes back and he says, "Oh my goodness, I'll just have to get my bull moose party going again." Well, that's all a lot of cock and bull because they were supposed to split the vote with Taft. He was going to split the vote with William Howard Taft to allow Woodrow Wilson to become president, so that the Warburg's manager, Colonel House, could get their Federal Reserve passed, and among other things. And in House's book, Philip Drew Administrator, which was published in 1911, anonymously, because House didn't want to let the cat out of the bag too soon. It was, as he called it, quote, socialism is dreamed of by Karl Marx, which is exactly what it was and exactly what the fulfillment of their ultimate plan is. And I mentioned the same year that 1911 St. Louis Post-Dispatch cartoon showing the same thing at Wall Street. Rockefeller, Carnegie, all say delighted to Karl Marx, and Marx has a copy of a book called Socialism under his arm. And then Franklin Lane, I believe it was Secretary of the Interior during the Wilson administration, said, "Yep, everything in Philip Drew is coming to pass." And then FDR would pick that up with his National Planning Board. That sort of thing. And he tried to pack the Supreme Court because he wasn't getting his legislation through, and that got knocked down. And it was, like I said, under FDR that they had these intricate plans for social planning, even down to the neighborhood. J.L. Marino developed this in sociometry, as he called it. And he had, Marino had met, I think it was around 1929 or 30, where Marino up in Hyde Park, before FDR even became president, and met him up in Hyde Park, which is where the Franklin sort of hung out a lot, and talked to him about it, sitting on a bench, just happened to run into each other on a park bench. And when FDR got up, he said, "I'll see how I can put your plans in place when I get into Washington." FDR said so, and he did. And the whole thing was planned, moving us further and further towards socialism. And that's why Al Smith, although he's for FDR in 1932, by 36, he said FDR's more socialist than the socialist. And we'll pick up after the break.
Okay, and of course our guest is Dr. Dennis Cuddy. Understand, ladies and gentlemen, most of what you have been taught in school, most of what you read in the newspaper and hear on television isn't true. It's time you begin to understand there's a subversive element that controls America, and we better take it back soon.